This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. What you are watching unfold is quieter than that and more dangerous. It is the slow replacement of rules with pressure, of agreements with leverage, of shared systems with weapons that look like paperwork. You are told this is about discipline, about enforcement, about making the world behave. But systems do not behave. They respond. And when pressure becomes policy, the response is not compliance. It is construction. Parallel systems, long timelines, commitments that do not make headlines until they cannot be reversed. If that sounds abstract, stay with me, because abstraction is how this hides. I want you to notice what is not being said out loud. I want you to watch what keeps getting built while everyone argues about threats. If you're still here, good. You need the next piece to see why this doesn't slow down on its own. What actually controls this system now is not ideology, not values, not even alliances. It is access, access to energy, access to capital, access to infrastructure that lasts longer than any administration. For decades, power came from writing the rules, trade rules, financial rules, security rules, but something has shifted. Now, power comes from the ability to deny access to those rules, to switch systems off, to tell countries, comply, or you don't get to participate. That feels decisive, it feels strong, but it quietly changes the system itself. Because when access becomes conditional, dependency becomes dangerous. And when dependency becomes dangerous, the rational response is exit. Not loudly, not all at once, piece by piece. Energy contracts that run for decades, infrastructure that cannot be rerouted overnight, financing structures that bypass traditional channels. None of this looks like rebellion. It looks like paperwork, engineering, long meetings that don't trend. But once these systems are built, pressure stops working the way it used to. And that's the part almost no one is talking about yet. There was a time when pressure worked quickly. A threat was issued, markets reacted, behavior changed. That was the assumption. And it was reasonable because the system was shared. Before, if you were cut off, there was nowhere else to go. Energy flowed through the same channels. Money cleared through the same systems. Projects depended on the same approvals. Now compare that to what is quietly becoming normal. Long-term projects measured in decades, not election cycles. Energy cooperation that requires permanent technical support. Financing structures designed to survive isolation. This didn't arrive overnight. That's why it mattered so little when it began. Each step looked defensive, temporary, practical. But slow change is the most dangerous kind because it doesn't trigger alarms. What used to be leverage is becoming a liability. What used to enforce compliance is now motivating redesign. And here's the critical shift. Once alternatives exist, pressure stops being persuasive. It becomes instructive. It teaches systems how to leave. The question now isn't whether this shift is happening. It's how far it goes before anyone admits it's real. And that brings us to the first visible shock. The first shock doesn't look like a crisis. That's why it matters. A multi-decade nuclear energy agreement, billions committed, technology transferred, training included, not announced in a vacuum, announced in the middle of threats, sanctions, talk of strikes. While pressure was escalating, something else locked in. Because nuclear cooperation isn't symbolic, it is binding. From construction to operation to decommissioning, these systems require constant support, fuel, maintenance, expertise. This is not a purchase. It is a relationship measured in generations, and it directly contradicts the assumption that isolation still works. You can sanction trade, you can threaten markets, but you cannot unwind a reactor partnership without rewriting physics, contracts, and time. If you were told pressure was tightening, this should have made you pause. Because while attention was fixed on warnings and rhetoric, the infrastructure of resistance was being poured into concrete. If you're still watching, notice this pattern. The shock isn't the project itself. The shock is what it tells us about the limits of coercion, because this was only one layer, and the next one moves even faster. What makes this system work is not defiance, it's design. The damage from pressure does not disappear. It gets redistributed. Who benefits is not mysterious. Who absorbs the cost is not random. When access is denied, alternatives are financed. Loans replace markets. State guarantees replace private risk. Technical dependence replaces open competition. In this structure, revenue flows one way. Influence flows the other. Energy projects generate income. But more importantly, they generate obligation. Fuel cycles, maintenance contracts, training pipelines. Once built, these systems cannot function independently. They require a partner. And that partner gains leverage without issuing a single threat. This is the quiet inversion. Pressure was supposed to weaken. Instead, it concentrated relationships. Sanctions were supposed to isolate. Instead, they sorted the world into tighter clusters. Those inside the pressure absorb volatility. Those outside redesign permanence. And the most important part is this: no one needs to announce that this system exists. It only becomes visible when pressure escalates and nothing moves. And that's exactly what happens next. Because once the mechanism is in place, escalation stops being abstract. It becomes immediate. Then the tempo changes. Fast decisions, short timelines, extreme numbers, 500%, not a tariff, a warning shot, not aimed only at one country, aimed at anyone who refuses to comply, buy the wrong energy, trade with the wrong partner, and the cost becomes unbearable. This is escalation without diplomacy, pressure without off-ramps, and it lands everywhere at once. Major economies, essential supply chains, countries that are not enemies, but customers. The logic is simple: force a choice. Us or them. But systems don't like ultimatums. They fracture. Trade reroutes. Discounts deepen. Alternatives accelerate. The faster the pressure, the faster the redesign. And here's the destabilizing truth. At this level, coercion stops deterring behavior. It hardens it. Because once the penalty is total, there is nothing left to lose. This is the moment where leverage turns brittle, where threats expose limits, and the damage doesn't show up first in capitals. It shows up closer. Much closer. This is where it reaches you. Not as foreign policy, not as strategy, as friction, prices that don't make sense anymore, supply chains that feel unpredictable, energy costs that spike, dip, then spike again. You are told this is temporary, that it's necessary, that it's the cost of resolve. But what you're actually experiencing is a system under stress from its own tools. When pressure replaces coordination, volatility becomes normal. And normal volatility gets priced into everything: your utilities, your groceries, your retirement accounts. This isn't about sympathy for other countries. It's about exposure. Because when economic weapons are used at scale, blowback is not a mistake. It's a feature. If you feel like the world is getting harder to predict, that's not your imagination. That uncertainty is being manufactured upstream. Stay with me. Because this doesn't stay domestic. It doesn't stay contained. And it doesn't stay slow. Once systems fracture, the ripples don't respect borders. Energy doesn't reroute quietly. Neither does trade. When major economies are forced to choose, they don't always choose compliance. They choose insulation. New corridors get built. New hubs emerge. Old choke points lose leverage. What used to flow through familiar channels starts moving around them, and that changes pricing everywhere. Contracts get rewritten, shipping timelines stretch, insurance costs rise. This is how a local decision becomes a global condition, because when parallel systems form, efficiency drops, redundancy rises. And the cost of everything goes up, not in one dramatic spike, in a series of smaller shocks that never quite settle. This isn't fragmentation on paper. It's fragmentation in motion. And once enough of the world adjusts to living with uncertainty, stability stops being the baseline. It becomes optional, which brings us to the question no one wants to answer yet. What happens next when pressure no longer produces alignment? Because from here, the future doesn't move in one direction. It splits. From here, there are three paths. None of them are clean. The first is adjustment. Pressure remains, but it softens. Exceptions multiply. Enforcement becomes selective. The system bends without breaking. This path preserves the appearance of control, but it admits quietly that leverage has limits, that rules cannot be enforced everywhere all the time. The second path is erosion. Pressure stays high. Compliance becomes partial. Workarounds become standard. The system still exists, but fewer people trust it. Rules are followed when convenient, ignored when costly. Credibility leaks out slowly, and once it's gone, it doesn't come back on command. The third path is rupture. Pressure escalates again. Ultimatums harden. Retaliation spreads. Parallel systems stop being alternatives and become defaults. Coordination collapses into blocks. mistakes become irreversible. None of these paths are theoretical. All of them are already visible in fragments. What matters now is not which path is chosen deliberately. It's which one emerges accidentally. And that brings us to the part no one gets to opt out of. The ending. Here is what makes this dangerous. No one has to decide to end the system. They only have to keep using it the way they are. Every escalation narrows options. Every workaround hardens alternatives. Every exception teaches the system how to survive without permission. And at some point, coordination doesn't collapse. It becomes irrelevant. That moment doesn't arrive with an announcement. It arrives when pressure is applied and nothing moves, when threats are issued and absorbed, when leverage is spent and produces silence. If that happens, the question is no longer who is right or who is strong. The question is whether the world still shares a system at all. If you want reassurance, this is not the place for it, because unresolved systems don't drift back to stability on their own. They accelerate. If you're still watching, don't stop here. This story does not end with policy. It continues with consequences, and the next piece is already forming. Stay with me.